Let's talk about all of these new developments and more with Frank Gaffney. Frank is the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Ronald Reagan. Frank, thank you for being with us tonight.
It's great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Frank, let's start off with Sri Lanka. The government warning of more attacks. As we mentioned, Israel's also issued a warning. Islamic State has claimed responsibility for this. If this is indeed Islamic State, Frank, what is their goal? What is their grievance, if you will, in Sri Lanka? What are they hoping for there?
I believe the goal that the Islamic State, and for that matter, every other jihadist group on the planet, including, by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is putatively a non-violent, supremacist group. I call it a Sharia supremacist group, is to bring about the triumph of this brutally repressive, indeed totalitarian Islamic doctrine of Sharia worldwide, on Muslims and non-Muslims alike. They'll use violence where they think that will be effective. Terrifying violence is preferred. Where it's not, they'll be just as happy to use sort of stealthy, subversive techniques. And we've certainly seen a lot of that being done in this country in recent years, and certainly in Europe and other parts of the West. So that's a common agenda, and unfortunately, in this case, violence was an option, and it's the preferred technique.
Frank, Sri Lanka's defense minister, as well as others, have suggested that these bombings were in retaliation for those deadly attacks on Muslims in mosques in New Zealand. What do you make of that?
Well, it may or may not have been a pretext, but I believe that, again, whether they had a pretext or not, the objective would have been there. The opportunity evidently was there, so much so that even though the government of Sri Lanka had forewarning that attacks would be coming against Christian churches on Easter Sunday, I believe, for weeks, nothing was done by the government of Sri Lanka, even to warn the prospective targets, let alone to shut the danger down. This suggests to me something that I think is important as we talk about more generally what's happening around the world, specifically to Christians who are being persecuted. By some estimates, some 300 million of them are being heavily persecuted. And I think that's partly because the people who perpetrate such persecution, whether it's the Islamic State, whether it's governments of various kinds or other groups, feel that they can do so with impunity as long as they're going after Christians. So one of my personal takeaways from this, and a message that I'm anxious to share with everybody, including your audience, is we need to change that calculation. If we want to try to discourage these sorts of attacks, it's not enough to simply, have memorial services or try to chase around after people after they've been done. We need to incentivize the governments in question to take care of these Christians, not persecute them,
Frank,
and to shut down those who are trying to harm them.
Frank, to your point, there were Easter attacks over the past 2 years. In 2017, in Egypt, Christians attacked there. In Pakistan in 2016, Christians also killed over Easter. So why is there this seeming reluctance to identify this Christian persecution? Why is there this seeming lack of will to say, look, here's the problem. We do have Christians being persecuted around the world, and most of the time it is at the hands of Islamic militants.
It's a very important question. Thank you for asking it. I think in part it's because the people who, as you say, are predominantly responsible, not exclusively, about 80%, the estimates are, of those who are being persecuted around the world are being persecuted basically by Islamists, people who have this Sharia supremacist agenda. There are, however, others. In India, Hindus are principally responsible. In China, it's the state. In North Korea, it's the government there. Large numbers of people being persecuted, but the bulk of the problem is caused by not all Muslims, to be sure, but those who embrace this idea that Sharia must rule the world and it is their duty from Allah to impose it. And the problem arises that we have now been told in this country, and I think elsewhere as well, well, you can't say anything that might be deemed critical of Muslims or Islam or Sharia or other aspects of their faith, the Prophet Muhammad, because that would be Islamophobic, that would be hateful, racist, and bigoted. In point of fact, it's necessary, if you're going to stop this kind of activity, to call it out, and as I say, to hold people accountable. But for the press, for elites in government and elsewhere, it's become the norm to say there's nothing to this. Oftentimes they say it's not even terrorism, for heaven's sakes, let alone that it's caused by Sharia supremacists. We can't defend ourselves, whether you're Christian or you're some other faith, we cannot defend ourselves against totalitarian jihadism in the name of Sharia unless we're willing to recognize it and describe it as it is.
Frank, I want to focus back on Sri Lanka and ISIS, and I hear all the points that you're making. What does it say that ISIS is staging these attacks in Sri Lanka? Does it mean that it has been defeated in Syria and Iraq, that its efforts to form a caliphate have been thwarted? What does it say about ISIS at large?
Well, again, I don't want to persist in backing the lens up, but it is important to understand this is only one of the places where ISIS is trying to demonstrate it's still in business. Another is Nigeria. And it's not just on Easter that these attacks are taking place. They're taking place on a continuous basis, and including in places like France. You know, we saw this magnificent cathedral burned, but it's only one of hundreds, indeed thousands, that have been attacked.
Well, we don't know
ISIS
that,
is
just to be
trying
clear,
desperately to show that it's real.
There has been no evidence that Notre Dame was attacked by Muslims or anyone else. I just wanted to clarify that point, though.
I'm simply saying that I personally am very suspicious about the idea that this would have happened without somebody setting the fire. But my point was simply to say, whatever one thought or whatever ultimately is determined about
Frank,
Notre Dame,
stick around. We have to go to a hard break. We'll
continue
continue this discussion on the other side of this. Joining us once again is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the CEO of the Center for Security Policy and a former Assistant Secretary of Defense under President Ronald Reagan. Frank, what do you make of the foreign minister's comments there?
I think that the Iranian government is becoming quite desperate. In addition to the point that you've made about the further constriction by the Trump administration on its ability to sell its principal product, energy, oil and gas, the cumulative effect of the other sanctions is crippling. The designating of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, one of the main stays of the regime, as a terrorist organization, is further causing problems because it owns a good chunk of the Iranian economy. And then there are some acts of God that are taking place in Iran, as I'm sure you know, the flooding and a billion or so locusts. I mean, truly a biblical plague of locusts has descended upon Iran. All of this is, I think, creating a crisis for the regime. There are reports that a senior IRGC officer has defected with a lot of secrets. I don't know if that's true or not, but this tends to suggest that they're trying to hold on to power, and they're perhaps prepared even to threaten missile or other kinds of attacks in the Strait of Hormuz to shut that waterway down as a bid somehow to, I guess, try to get its people to believe that they need to stick with the government in time of war or crisis. I don't think it's going to work. I think the people are really sick of this government and the theocratic craziness and support for jihad and all of the sanctions and everything else that's come their way as a result of it. And I think it's imperative that we be helping them bring about its early, 40 years on, it's without much further ado, it's passing.
The Trump administration has said that regime change is not its intended goal, that its intended goal with these sanctions is to force Tehran back to the negotiating table to negotiate a deal that does indeed prevent it from getting nuclear weapons, and that also curbs Iran's other activities in the region, its sponsoring of proxy terrorist groups. Do you think that the Trump administration is on the right track here?
I think what it's doing, whatever its goal may be, is exactly right. And I hope it will continue doing it, and I hope it will redouble its efforts, as I say, specifically to try to help empower and enable the Iranian people to bring about an end of this regime, which is oppressing them horribly as well as threatening the rest of us. But as to what their policy is, I'm not an employee of the government. I'm not speaking for the Trump administration. I am, however, very appreciative of what President Trump has done that I think is giving rise at last to the possibility that this end of the regime might be at hand.
Frank, can it ever be done without support of European allies? Can the U.S. do this on its own as it has been?
Well, I think what we've seen, grudging though it may be, is the support of European allies. They have said they want to continue the nuclear agreement. They want to have their companies continue to do business with them.
Frank, they've had mechanisms to bypass U.S. sanctions. I mean, can the U.S. succeed in getting Iran to the table unless the Europeans do at some point come in and assist the U.S.?
They've had mechanisms to bypass the sanctions. It's just that their companies don't want to take the risk that they'll wind up dealing with Iran and be shut out of the U.S. market. And as long as that's the case, whether, again, it's the government's intention or not, I think we're seeing effectively support for the sanctions regime. And that's what's taking the toll on this government in Tehran.
Frank, I want to change focus on another nuclear foe, that's North Korea. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un just wrapped up his first summit with Russia's President Vladimir Putin, and it comes 2 months after Kim's last summit with President Trump collapsed without any agreements. Following Thursday's talks in Russia, Putin said that Kim is open to denuclearization, but that he wants some assurances about his country's security and sovereignty. Let's take a listen to what Putin had to say. All right. Well, Putin there was saying that he thinks that it's only fair that the North Koreans be granted security assurances, security guarantees. Frank, what is Putin's agenda in getting himself involved here, do you think?
I think, as Putin has done everywhere, in the Middle East, in Europe, in Central Asia, in the Far East, he is up to no good. I think he is genuinely convinced that the United States created, with its NATO partners, the most horrific crime of the 20th century by bringing down the Soviet Union, and he's determined to get even. So what Putin is up to, I think, is quite simply trying to insinuate himself into any opening that he finds for the purposes of undermining the United States, for that matter, the global consensus, if need be, in order to promote what he sees as those who are, well, at odds with us. They are people, they are governments, they are organizations that are hostile, and I think it's basically sabotage, and that's I think what he sees as sort of his just revenge against the United States.
And Frank, Kim Jong-un is very well aware, I would imagine, that this is Putin's agenda, and he's intentionally using Russia as a counterweight to what's happening with the U.S. How do you think that the Trump administration should respond to this now? How do they proceed?
Well, I think what it's done so far is maintain what's called the maximum pressure campaign. And I think that that is ultimately what has to continue. I've not put a whole lot of stock, I must tell you, in the hope that there would be a parley that would result in the denuclearization of North Korea, no matter how much we hold out the hope that it will transform that country into, Shangri-La with investment and trade and so on. I think that Kim Jong-un, as his father and his forefather, his grandfather before him, are determined to remain a nuclear power and a threat to us, frankly.
Frank Gaffney, appreciate your perspective and your analysis. Thank you so much.